So just what options do those NATO leaders have, and what is actually being considered today? To discuss, our senior reporter Catherine Norris-Trent is with me here in the studio. Hi, Catherine.
Hi,
NATO has said it will continue to support Ukraine this winter. Tell us, though, a bit about the conditions on the ground, because I imagine both for soldiers and for civilians, it's probably going to get quite a bit worse.
That's right. And Jens Stoltenberg, you saw him there, he also said that Russia is using winter as a weapon of war. And that is certainly what we're hearing from on the ground, both in military terms and for Ukrainian civilians. So the bad weather there, very cold, and it has been very wet in recent weeks, has created somewhat of a freeze in the advances of the Ukrainian troops. We know that very muddy ground means that they can't advance us forward. We've seen pictures of almost First World War-like scenes of trench warfare, waterlogged, freezing conditions in the Donbass around the town of Bakhmut. And so that is making fighting a lot more difficult than it had been. So again, the Ukrainians are calling for more military aid. Now, when the ground freezes, as it will do soon, that would change the conditions even further. But it means that NATO's pledges of things like winter equipment for troops, fuel and generators, as well as medical supplies, could prove crucial, because really battling the elements is going to be one of the big challenges going forward, both for those soldiers on the front lines. The logistics become that much more complicated, and of course for the people throughout Ukraine, because Russia has, as we know, been bombing energy infrastructure, and people there are bracing. President Zelensky has warned them again and again that more strikes could come. So every time they repair some of the energy infrastructure, it gets hit again. And so lots of people have been without power and without heating. And in those freezing conditions, which can go down to below minus 20 centigrade, very difficult for people to survive. You've got humanitarian situations, disasters potentially emerging. And again, we could see an influx of refugees pouring out of Ukraine if they feel that those conditions are getting too hard. So that is why NATO is very much focusing on what they can do to ease the winter conditions.
Well, let's talk about what it is that NATO might do. It obviously has sent a significant number of weapons in the past. Do you think today, tomorrow, we'll hear more announcements of weapons deliveries?
Well, that is the $40 billion question. You might say that is the total so far that NATO countries have provided roughly in weaponry to Ukraine. And that, just to put it in perspective, is roughly the size of France's annual defence budget as a whole. So it's a huge amount of money that's being asked, and a huge amount of the stocks of weaponry of NATO countries. And so some of them say they're kind of hitting a brick wall, that they can't really keep on giving weapons to the same extent because their supplies are becoming very diminished. What this basically comes down to is that after the end of the Cold War, NATO countries focused on other types of warfare. They were looking more at terrorist threats or ISIS in the Middle East, and they weren't focusing perhaps on the tanks, the anti-aircraft weapons and the artillery that had been used, that they'd had stockpiles of in earlier decades. And so when this war, this latest round of fighting in Ukraine, broke out in February, well, the stockpiles just weren't there. So now they've been giving weapons. France, for example, has donated at least 18 modern Caesar artillery howitzers to Ukraine, but that's about 20% of its existing artillery, So there is reluctance from some countries to give more, because then they feel that they're leaving themselves unprotected. And the weaponry being used in Ukraine, just the amount of artillery shells being fired is so huge. Over the summer, there were thousands, perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 artillery shells being fired by the Ukrainian side every single day. That's far more than even the US can produce. So there are big questions about where the weapon supplies that Ukraine says it wants, especially anti-aircraft, to beat those drone attacks and aerial attacks. Where are those supplies going to come from?
Catherine Norris-Trent, thanks very much indeed. And we'll talk more about this with an analyst in London coming up in about 25 minutes' time. Catherine, thank you.